The human brain is a marvel of biological engineering, a complex organ that allows us to think, feel, move, and experience the world in a seamless flow of perception and action. At first glance, it seems like a single, unified control center, but in reality, it is made up of two distinct halves, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, each with its own specializations and tendencies. These two hemispheres are not separate entities working in isolation. They are connected by an intricate bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum, a dense bridge containing around 200 million axons, which allows them to share information at astonishing speeds. Without this constant exchange, our experience of reality would be fragmented, disjointed, and in many ways incomprehensible. The corpus callosum ensures that what is processed in one hemisphere is quickly made available to the other, creating the impression of a single, coherent consciousness. For most of us, this communication is so seamless that we are never aware of it. We don't stop to think that when our right hand reaches for a glass of water, it is our left hemisphere that controls the movement, while our right hemisphere has already judged the glass's position, distance, and orientation in space. The two halves of the brain act together, like perfectly synchronized dancers, each leading and following at different moments without ever losing the rhythm. This unity is not just a convenient arrangement. It is the foundation for how we perceive ourselves and the world. Our brains are lateralized, meaning certain functions are more dominant in one hemisphere than the other. In most right-handed people, for example, the left hemisphere is primarily responsible for language, speech production, grammar, and vocabulary, while the right hemisphere excels in spatial reasoning, facial recognition, and processing music. These specializations are not rigid, but they are consistent enough to be noticeable in both research and daily life. The magic happens when the two sides exchange their strengths. A conversation, for example, might begin in the left hemisphere's language centers, but understanding tone, sarcasm, or emotional nuance relies heavily on the right hemisphere's interpretive abilities. A painting might first be perceived by the right hemisphere's holistic visual processing, but describing it in words requires the left hemisphere's analytical and linguistic skills. Without the bridge between them, each side would have only half the story, and the richness of our experience would be diminished. The corpus callosum itself is a masterpiece of evolution. It is not just a static cable, it is a dynamic network, with signals traveling back and forth in milliseconds. Neuroscientists have compared its role to that of a conductor in an orchestra, ensuring that different sections, strings, woodwinds, percussion, stay in time and in harmony. The analogy holds because the brain's hemispheres, while capable of operating independently, produce the most coherent and complex results when their activity is coordinated. Functional MRI scans of people performing everyday tasks reveal this beautifully. Even when a task seems to be localized in one hemisphere, there is still significant crosstalk, with patterns of activation lighting up across both sides. The unity we experience as consciousness is, in many ways, the emergent property of this high-speed collaboration. From an evolutionary perspective, this integration was a turning point. Early vertebrates had simpler brains with more localized processing, but as behaviors became more complex and survival required more adaptive responses, it became advantageous to integrate the different kinds of information each hemisphere processed. In humans, the neocortex expanded dramatically, and the need for interhemispheric communication grew alongside. Our ability to combine logical, sequential reasoning with creative, holistic thinking is one of the hallmarks of our species. It is what allows us to write symphonies, build spacecraft, tell stories, and solve complex problems. Each of these achievements depends on a balance between the hemispheres. Neither pure analysis nor pure imagination is enough on its own. This balance is so fundamental that we rarely notice how dependent we are on it until it is disrupted. Neurological injuries, strokes, or congenital malformations of the corpus callosum reveal just how much of our unified experience depends on that hidden bridge. In rare cases where people are born without a corpus callosum, a condition called agenesis of the corpus callosum, there can be remarkable adaptations, with other neural pathways compensating, but subtle deficits often remain. These might appear in the integration of complex tasks, the speed of processing, or the coordination of emotional and verbal responses. In cases where the corpus callosum is damaged later in life, the changes can be more dramatic, affecting everything from motor coordination to problem solving. The unity of the brain also underlies our sense of self. We feel like a single I because the information flowing between hemispheres is integrated into one coherent narrative. Our brains are constantly stitching together the inputs from different sensory channels and different processing centers, smoothing over any inconsistencies in timing or detail. This is why we do not perceive the microsecond delays between when our eyes register something and when our conscious mind becomes aware of it. It is why we don't notice the small gaps that occur when one hemisphere processes something before the other. The integration is so fast and so efficient that our subjective experience feels instantaneous and whole. Yet, this unity is in some ways an illusion, a product of continuous synchronization between two separate but deeply linked systems. The idea that consciousness might not be as singular as it feels becomes even more striking when we consider what happens if the corpus callosum is deliberately severed, as in certain neurosurgical procedures for severe epilepsy. In those cases, the hemispheres are prevented from sharing most of their information, and what emerges can challenge our most basic intuitions about the mind. But in the intact brain, the bridge ensures that each hemisphere's specialized strengths are shared, allowing us to function with remarkable efficiency and adaptability. When you read a sentence, your left hemisphere processes the meaning of the words, but your right hemisphere contributes to understanding their emotional tone. When you navigate a room, your right hemisphere maps the space, but your left hemisphere organizes a plan for moving through it. Every complex task we perform is the result of countless moments of collaboration between the halves. Even in everyday life, this collaboration shapes how we think and feel. When someone speaks to you, the words are parsed in one hemisphere, but the subtle cues in their voice, hesitation, excitement, irony, are interpreted in the other. When you solve a problem, the step-by-step reasoning of one hemisphere is balanced by the broad, pattern-based insights of the other. This interplay is not just useful, it is essential to the way we experience being human. Without it, our mental life would be narrower, more literal, and less adaptive. The corpus callosum does not just transmit data, it blends it into something greater than the sum of its parts. The unified functioning of the brain is thus both a biological fact and a profound mystery. On one hand, we can trace the pathways, measure the signals, and map the regions that communicate. On the other hand, we still do not fully understand how this integration gives rise to the subjective feeling of a singular, continuous self. What we do know is that the interaction between the hemispheres is critical for a coherent perception of the world. It allows us to merge logic with intuition, detail with context, action with intention. It gives us the ability to be both analytical and creative, precise and imaginative, grounded in reality, yet capable of dreaming beyond it. The unity of the brain is, in many ways, the unity of our experience as conscious beings. Without it, the mind would not be what it is, and without the corpus callosum, the halves of our brain would be like two voices speaking in the same head, but unable to hear each other. The fact that we live our lives never noticing this constant dialogue is a testament to how well evolution has refined this system. It is a hidden partnership that shapes every thought, every movement, every feeling we have, and it is the silent architect of the reality we take for granted. To imagine what it means to turn off half the brain is to enter a territory that is both fascinating and unsettling, because the very phrase suggests a radical alteration of how we think, move, and perceive the world. The brain is not like a computer where you can simply unplug one processor and expect the rest of the system to run in a diminished but still coherent form. Each hemisphere is not only specialized in certain functions, but is also deeply dependent on the other for information and context. Disrupting or disabling one half can happen in a variety of ways, each with its own causes, mechanisms, and consequences, and while the specifics differ, they all share one common theme. The loss of integration between the hemispheres fundamentally changes how the mind works. One of the most dramatic scenarios involves physical damage to one hemisphere, whether from a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, or a tumor. A severe stroke in the left hemisphere, for example, can impair speech, language comprehension, and the ability to produce coherent sentences, because in most people, these functions are concentrated there. At the same time, the right hemisphere might remain capable of understanding tone and emotional nuance, and it might still recognize familiar faces or navigate space effectively. But without the left hemisphere's contributions, the person may not be able to verbalize their thoughts or may lose the precise grammar and vocabulary that give language its structure. Similarly, damage to the right hemisphere can leave language largely intact while undermining the ability to perceive spatial relationships, recognize faces, or interpret nonverbal cues. Such damage can also lead to neglect syndrome, in which the person becomes unaware of one side of their own body or the space around them, as if it simply does not exist. In both cases, it is not just a matter of losing certain skills. It is a disruption in how the remaining hemisphere can coordinate and integrate information into a coherent whole. Another way of turning off half the brain is through surgical separation, most famously in the form of corpus callosotomy, a procedure in which the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres, is severed. This surgery has been used primarily to treat severe, drug-resistant epilepsy, or seizures spread rapidly from one hemisphere to the other through the corpus callosum. By cutting the connection, surgeons can confine seizures to one side, reducing their overall severity and frequency. From the perspective of each hemisphere, however, it is as if its twin has gone silent. Visual information presented to one half may never reach the other, and motor commands that would normally be coordinated across the body may no longer be shared. The effects of this disconnection are often subtle in everyday life because each hemisphere can still operate independently, but in controlled experiments, the differences become striking. One hemisphere may see something but not be able to name it, while the other can name it but not recognize it in the same way. Over time, each side adapts, but the bridge is gone, and the unity of conscious experience is altered in ways that can challenge our definition of what a single mind is. A third, less visible form of disabling half the brain comes from functional suppression, where one hemisphere's activity is temporarily reduced or inhibited without physical damage or cutting. This can be induced experimentally using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, which can disrupt neural activity in targeted regions for brief periods. In more extreme cases, functional suppression happens as a result of neurological conditions like hemisphere-specific epileptic activity, where intense electrical discharges in one hemisphere essentially drown out its normal functions, leaving the other side to take over. An even more controlled version of this is the WADA test, a diagnostic procedure in which an anesthetic is injected into one of the brain's major arteries to put one hemisphere to sleep for a short time. During this period, doctors can assess the specific contributions of each hemisphere to language, memory, and other cognitive skills. Patients undergoing the WADA test may suddenly lose the ability to speak or move one side of the body, only to regain it when the anesthetic wears off, providing a clear and immediate demonstration of each hemisphere's unique role. Each of these scenarios reveals that turning off half the brain is not like shutting down half of a machine, where the remaining half can still run in an orderly fashion with fewer resources. The hemispheres are not redundant backups of each other. They are complementary systems, each carrying out specialized processes that the other cannot fully replicate. Disabling one side means removing access to those processes, leaving the other hemisphere to work with incomplete information. The brain's remarkable plasticity means that the intact hemisphere can often adapt, sometimes taking over functions it does not normally perform, but this adaptation is rarely perfect. Language recovery after left hemisphere damage, for example, is possible but often comes with limitations in fluency and complexity. Spatial reasoning after right hemisphere damage can improve but may never regain its former precision. The psychological experience of losing or disconnecting one hemisphere is difficult to describe because it challenges the unity of consciousness we take for granted. In cases of surgical separation, some patients report feeling entirely normal, unaware of any inner division, until specific tasks reveal it. Others describe moments when their hands seem to act at odds with each other or when they feel as if their thoughts are being interrupted by an alien influence, even though both sides belong to them. When one hemisphere is shut down temporarily in a WADA test, the change can be abrupt and disorienting. A sudden loss of speech or control over one side of the body without any sense of injury. The return of function can be just as abrupt, like waking from a brief and oddly lopsided dream. From a neuroscientific perspective, these disruptions offer an unparalleled opportunity to study the contributions of each hemisphere in isolation. By observing how people behave and what abilities are lost when one hemisphere is disabled, researchers can map cognitive functions with greater precision. But they also raise deep philosophical questions about the nature of the self. If one hemisphere can operate without awareness of the other, what does that mean for our sense of being a single, continuous person? If each half can have its own perceptions and even its own intentions, are there in some sense two minds in one skull, coexisting and cooperating most of the time, but capable of functioning apart when forced to? The human brain evolved for integration, and when that integration is interrupted, the result is not simply a diminished version of normal functioning, but a different mode of existence altogether. The richness of our thought, the subtlety of our emotions, and the fluidity of our actions all depend on the constant, invisible exchange between hemispheres. Turning off half the brain removes part of the conversation, and the remaining voice must speak without hearing its counterpart. Whether this silence comes from physical damage, surgical separation, or temporary suppression, the outcome is a reminder of how much of our identity depends on the partnership between the two halves of the brain. We are not one mind with a spare copy, but a single consciousness woven from the cooperation of two distinct but inseparable halves. And when one is gone, the tapestry changes in ways that can be subtle, startling, or profound. The corpus callosum is one of the most important structures in the human brain, an elegant and dense bridge of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres. It lies deep in the brain, curving like a broad, flattened arch beneath the cerebral cortex, and although it is only a few centimeters thick, it contains an estimated 200 to 250 million axons. These axons are the long, thread-like projections of neurons that carry electrical impulses, and in the case of the corpus callosum, they are specialized for one job, ensuring that the two halves of the brain can communicate with each other instantly and continuously. This structure is not unique to humans. Many mammals have a corpus callosum, but in our species, it is particularly well developed, reflecting the complexity of the information being exchanged. Without it, the brain's hemispheres would function more like two independent processors, each handling its own tasks in isolation. With it, they are able to combine their specialized abilities into a single, integrated mental experience. Anatomically, the corpus callosum can be divided into four main regions: the rostrum, genu, body or trunk, and splenium. The rostrum is the thin front portion that curves downward toward the front of the brain, connecting parts of the frontal lobes. The genu is the anterior bend of the corpus callosum, where fibers fan out to link the left and right frontal lobes more broadly. The body, or trunk, runs along the middle and connects large regions of the frontal and parietal lobes. Finally, the splenium at the rear is the thickest part, linking the occipital lobes and parts of the temporal lobes. This arrangement is not random. The fibers are organized so that specific cortical regions are connected to their counterparts on the opposite side. This precise mapping ensures that corresponding areas in each hemisphere can coordinate their activity, whether that means sharing sensory data, aligning motor plans, or merging higher-level cognitive processes. Functionally, the corpus callosum is indispensable for integrating sensory information. Take vision, for example. Because of the way the optic nerves cross, information from the left visual field of both eyes is processed in the right hemisphere, while information from the right visual field is processed in the left hemisphere. To perceive the world as a single, unified scene, the hemispheres must exchange this information. The splenium of the corpus callosum plays a critical role in passing visual data from one side to the other, allowing you to match what one half of your brain sees with what the other half sees. This integration is so seamless that we are not aware of the split. We simply experience a continuous panoramic view. When the splenium is damaged, people can experience unusual visual deficits, such as being able to recognize objects only in one half of the visual field or having difficulty matching visual information with verbal labels. The auditory system also benefits from the corpus callosum's work. While each ear sends signals to both hemispheres, there is a dominant pathway that favors the opposite side of the brain. For tasks like locating the source of a sound or distinguishing between overlapping voices, the hemispheres must compare their inputs. The corpus callosum facilitates this rapid comparison, enabling accurate spatial hearing and complex auditory processing. This is particularly important for language, where timing differences of mere milliseconds can distinguish one phoneme from another. Without efficient cross-hemisphere communication, these subtle distinctions can be harder to perceive, and speech comprehension can suffer, especially in noisy environments. Motor control is another domain where the corpus callosum is vital. The brain controls the body in a crossed fashion. The left hemisphere directs the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere directs the left. Many everyday actions, however, require both sides to work in harmony. Walking, typing, playing a musical instrument, or even tying shoelaces all involve precisely timed coordination between both hands or both legs. The corpus callosum allows the motor regions in each hemisphere to share plans and feedback, ensuring that bilateral movements are smooth and synchronized. In people with callosal damage or surgical disconnection, this coordination can be disrupted, sometimes producing what is known as alien hand syndrome, in which one hand acts at cross purposes to the other, as if it were controlled by a separate will. Beyond sensory and motor functions, the corpus callosum has an essential role in higher cognitive processes. Many complex tasks, solving a problem, recalling a memory, interpreting a social situation, require the combined strengths of both hemispheres. The left hemisphere's analytic, language-based approach is complemented by the right hemisphere's holistic, pattern-oriented perspective. The corpus callosum enables these different processing styles to inform and refine each other. For example, in reading, the left hemisphere may focus on the sequence of letters and the syntax of a sentence, while the right hemisphere contributes to understanding tone, context, and metaphor. In creative endeavors like composing music or designing a building, the exchange of information between hemispheres can be seen in the balance between technical precision and aesthetic sensibility. The importance of the corpus callosum becomes especially clear when it is absent or impaired. In cases of agenesis of the corpus callosum, where the structure fails to develop, other brain pathways can sometimes compensate, but integration is often slower and less efficient. People with this condition may have subtle difficulties in tasks that require rapid coordination between hemispheres, such as interpreting social cues or processing complex problem-solving tasks. When the corpus callosum is surgically severed in a split-brain procedure, the effects can be both subtle and striking. In everyday life, many functions remain intact because each hemisphere is capable of independent operation, but specialized testing can reveal that the hemispheres are no longer sharing certain types of information. This might manifest as the inability to verbally name an object placed in the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, because the language centers in the left hemisphere are not receiving the necessary sensory data. Research into the corpus callosum has shown that it is not a monolithic communication line, but a finely tuned system with different types of fibers serving different purposes. Some fibers are large and heavily myelinated, optimized for rapid transmission of urgent or time-sensitive information, such as motor commands or synchronized sensory updates. Others are thinner and slower, likely involved in sharing more complex or less time-critical data. The organization of these fibers reflects the balance between speed and detail that is necessary for the brain's integration. This specialization helps explain why some cognitive functions are more affected than others when the corpus callosum is damaged. The role of the corpus callosum extends even to emotional processing. Studies using brain imaging and neuropsychological testing suggest that emotional experiences are often lateralized, with the right hemisphere playing a dominant role in perceiving and generating emotional responses, especially negative emotions, and the left hemisphere more involved in positive emotions and in regulating affect. The corpus callosum allows these emotional responses to be integrated with reasoning and language, enabling us to articulate what we feel and to respond appropriately to social situations. When this integration is impaired, people may experience emotions without being able to explain them, or they may articulate feelings without the corresponding depth of emotional experience. Understanding the corpus callosum is also important in the context of brain plasticity. After injury or surgery, the brain often reorganizes itself, and in some cases, other commissures, smaller bundles of fibers connecting the hemispheres, can take over some of the callosum's functions. The anterior commissure, for example, can transmit certain types of visual and auditory information, though not with the same efficiency or breadth as the corpus callosum. This adaptability underscores the brain's resilience, but it also highlights just how central the corpus callosum is to normal functioning. No other structure matches its capacity for comprehensive, high-speed interhemispheric communication. In essence, the corpus callosum is not just a physical bridge, but a dynamic conduit for the exchange of sensory, motor, and cognitive information. It allows the two halves of the brain to operate not as separate units, but as a single, unified system, each side enriching and refining the other's work. Whether we are speaking, moving, imagining, or remembering, this bridge is active, integrating the diverse talents of each hemisphere into a coherent whole. Its role is so fundamental that we rarely notice it until it is gone. Only then does the intricate choreography it enables become visible, revealing just how much of what we take for granted in our daily lives depends on the silent, constant conversation between the left and right sides of the brain. The history of split brain surgery begins with a problem that was both devastating and stubbornly resistant to treatment: severe, drug-resistant epilepsy. Epilepsy is a neurological condition characterized by sudden bursts of abnormal electrical activity in the brain, and in its most severe forms, seizures can be frequent, unpredictable, and profoundly disabling. For some patients, seizures originate in one hemisphere, but rapidly spread to the other through the corpus callosum, engulfing the entire brain in a storm of synchronized neural firing. When this happens, the seizure is often more intense and has more widespread effects, sometimes causing loss of consciousness, violent convulsions, or other dangerous symptoms. By the middle of the 20th century, neurologists and neurosurgeons were searching for ways to interrupt this spread, especially for patients whose seizures could not be controlled with medication. The idea emerged that if the primary bridge between the hemispheres could be cut, seizures would be confined to one side, limiting their severity and frequency. This approach did not appear out of nowhere. The concept of severing the corpus callosum had been explored earlier in animal studies, where researchers observed that such a procedure could prevent epileptic discharges from crossing between hemispheres. The early experiments showed that animals could still function in many respects even after the connection was severed, which was surprising to scientists who had expected catastrophic deficits. These findings encouraged neurosurgeons to consider the possibility that humans might also tolerate the loss of interhemispheric communication better than anticipated. In the 1940s, American neurosurgeon William Van Wagenen performed some of the first callosotomy procedures on patients, motivated by the need to control uncontrollable seizures. His work was pioneering but also controversial, as the long-term consequences were not well understood. The method that would come to be known as split brain surgery was refined in the 1960s, particularly through the work of neurosurgeons like Joseph Bogan and Philip Vogel in California. They operated on a series of patients with severe, intractable epilepsy, often after years of failed drug treatments and immense suffering. The surgical technique involved carefully cutting through the corpus callosum, sometimes completely, other times only partially, in order to leave some interhemispheric communication intact. The main surgical challenge was to avoid damaging surrounding brain structures while ensuring the callosal fibers were fully severed where intended. The operations were meticulous, and the decision to proceed was never taken lightly. These were patients for whom every other option had failed. The immediate goal of the surgery was straightforward: reduce the spread of seizures from one hemisphere to the other. By creating a barrier, the seizure activity could be confined, and the overall impact on the patient's daily functioning could be greatly reduced. In many cases, the results were striking. Patients reported fewer and less severe seizures, and some regained enough stability to return to work, pursue hobbies, or live more independently. For those who had been living under the constant shadow of unpredictable convulsions, this improvement was life-changing. Families noticed that their loved ones were more alert, more communicative, and less fatigued, as the body no longer had to endure the extreme stress of whole-brain seizures as frequently. At the time, it was generally expected that the main side effect would be minor and manageable. Early clinical observations suggested that many patients with a severed corpus callosum could walk, talk, and carry out normal daily activities without obvious impairment. There was no reason to suspect that anything as dramatic as the creation of two minds would result. because in routine behavior the hemispheres could still operate independently without producing glaring contradictions. The brain's adaptability and the ability of each hemisphere to handle many tasks on its own meant that patients could still engage in conversations, solve problems, and interact socially. This reinforced the belief that the corpus callosum's role, while important, could be sacrificed for the greater good of controlling seizures. However, the surgery soon attracted the attention of neuroscientists who wanted to understand what happened to brain function when the main bridge between hemispheres was removed. Among the most prominent was Roger Sperry, whose research with split-brain patients in the 1960s and 1970s revealed that the consequences of the surgery were far more intriguing than anyone had imagined. In carefully designed experiments, Sperry and his colleagues discovered that the two hemispheres, once disconnected, could process information separately and even hold different pieces of knowledge. For example, if an image was shown only to the right hemisphere, the patient might recognize it but be unable to name it, because the language centers in the left hemisphere had not received the information. Conversely, if the image was shown to the left hemisphere, the patient could name it but might not be able to draw it as accurately as the right hemisphere could. These findings challenged the assumption that consciousness was indivisible, suggesting instead that the brain might harbor parallel streams of awareness. From the surgical perspective, though, the success of the method was measured primarily in medical terms, not philosophical ones. The reduction in seizure activity was the primary metric, and by that measure, the procedure often succeeded remarkably well. Long-term follow-up studies showed that many patients experienced sustained seizure reduction, and for some, the frequency dropped by more than half. In partial callosotomies, where only the anterior portion of the corpus callosum was cut, the benefits were still substantial for certain patients, and this approach sometimes preserved more interhemispheric communication while still preventing the spread of seizures. The risks and limitations of the surgery became better understood over time. While many patients functioned well in daily life, certain subtle deficits could appear in specific situations. Coordinated use of both hands for tasks like buttoning a shirt could be affected, and some patients experienced difficulty transferring learned information from one hemisphere to the other. Visual information might be trapped on one side, and motor responses could be limited to the hemisphere that received the input. These issues were rarely debilitating, but they revealed the depth of the brain's reliance on its internal bridge. In children, the outcomes could be different, as younger brains often adapted more readily, rerouting some functions through alternative pathways. As the procedure's history unfolded, ethical considerations emerged as well. The decision to sever the corpus callosum is irreversible, and while the potential benefits for seizure control are substantial, the operation fundamentally changes the brain's communication system. Surgeons had to balance the certainty of ongoing, life-disrupting seizures against the unknowns of altering the brain in such a profound way. For patients and families, the choice was often driven by the sheer exhaustion and danger posed by uncontrolled epilepsy. In that context, the promise of relief outweighed the risks of cognitive side effects. Today, split-brain surgery remains a treatment of last resort, performed only when all other therapies have failed and when the seizures are severe enough to justify the intervention. Advances in neuroimaging, targeted medications, and other surgical techniques have reduced the frequency with which complete callosotomies are performed. Nonetheless, the historical development of this method has left an enduring mark on both neurosurgery and neuroscience. Medically, it provided a lifeline for patients who had exhausted every other option. Scientifically, it opened a unique window into the architecture of the mind, revealing the contributions and autonomy of each hemisphere in ways that could never have been observed otherwise. In retrospect, The expectations of the early surgeons were both accurate and incomplete. They were right that patients could live and function without a corpus callosum, and they were right that the operation could dramatically reduce seizure severity. But they could not have foreseen the depth of the revelations that would come from studying their patients. What began as a desperate measure to control a medical condition became one of the most illuminating natural experiments in the history of brain science. The split brain surgery demonstrated that the corpus callosum is not merely a passive cable, but a vital integrator of perception, action, and thought, and its absence can reveal the mind's hidden architecture in ways that are both surprising and profound. When the first patients emerged from split brain surgery, the medical teams and their families were often struck by how ordinary they seemed. These were individuals who had just undergone a profound alteration of their brain structure, yet in many cases they could talk, walk, read, write, and engage in casual conversation without any obvious signs that the bridge between their hemispheres had been severed. For the surgeons, this was a relief, because the primary goal of the operation had been to reduce debilitating seizures, not to transform personality or disrupt everyday life. The patients themselves often reported feeling much the same as before, apart from the improvement in seizure control. This apparent normalcy was, in the early days, taken as confirmation that the hemispheres could operate independently in most everyday contexts without significant disruption. But this impression began to change as more systematic testing was carried out, revealing subtle yet extraordinary effects that were hidden in normal conversation and daily routines. One of the first things researchers noticed was that the patient's normal appearance masked the fact that some kinds of information could no longer be easily shared between hemispheres. In everyday life, most activities draw on both sides of the brain in ways that are highly redundant. You can use one eye or one hand for many tasks without much trouble, and language, so central to our interactions, tends to be managed almost entirely by the left hemisphere in most people. This meant that, in casual encounters, a split-brain patient could appear perfectly fluent and coordinated. But when researchers designed experiments to isolate information to a single hemisphere, the situation changed dramatically. Using a clever setup in which stimuli were presented to only one visual field at a time, they could control which hemisphere received the information. For instance, if a picture of an object was flashed only to the left visual field, the information traveled to the right hemisphere, which typically does not control speech. The patient might recognize the object but be unable to name it. Instead, they could point to a matching picture with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, even though they could not verbally describe what they had just seen. Similarly, when an object was placed in the left hand out of sight, the right hemisphere could identify it by touch, but the patient might be unable to say what it was unless the object was moved into the right hand, allowing the left hemisphere to process it. This dissociation between knowledge and verbal report was striking because it suggested that each hemisphere had its own limited awareness and could operate independently under the right circumstances. The everyday fluidity of thought and speech was an illusion created by the fact that most of life's situations still allowed both hemispheres to get the same information, even if indirectly. Another surprising early finding was that motor control could sometimes become uncoupled in strange ways. In rare cases, patients exhibited what came to be known as intermanual conflict, where the hands seemed to act at cross purposes. A classic example was a patient trying to button a shirt with one hand while the other hand simultaneously unbuttoned it. This was not a deliberate act of sabotage, but an expression of the fact that each hemisphere could initiate actions independently, without the constant cross-checking that the corpus callosum normally provides. In everyday life, such conflicts were rare, but they demonstrated that the brain's two sides could have different, even competing, agendas when cut off from each other. Language itself provided fertile ground for subtle observations. Because the left hemisphere is usually dominant for speech, especially in right-handed people, the right hemisphere's abilities in this domain were often underestimated. When tested carefully, some patients' right hemispheres could understand written words and even produce simple verbal responses, though typically with limited vocabulary and grammatical complexity. Other patients showed almost no verbal ability on the right side, but could still process language well enough to follow spoken commands given to the left ear, which has stronger connections to the right hemisphere. This variability hinted at the individual differences in brain organization and the ways in which the two hemispheres can adapt over time. One of the more intriguing discoveries was that emotional responses could still be shared between hemispheres even without the corpus callosum. For instance, if an image designed to provoke fear or amusement was shown only to one hemisphere, the patient's whole body might react. Heart rate might increase. Facial expression might change, suggesting that subcortical pathways outside the corpus callosum could still transmit emotional information. This finding tempered the early idea that the hemispheres were now completely cut off from one another. Instead, it became clear that while the high-level exchange of complex, symbolic information like language was interrupted, other kinds of communication, especially those related to basic emotions, could still travel through older, deeper brain structures. From the patient's perspective, these hidden effects could sometimes be startling when revealed in the lab. Imagine being shown an image and realizing that you know what it is but cannot say the word aloud, or finding that one hand seems to know something your speaking mind does not. For most, these experiences were fleeting and limited to testing environments, but they provided a glimpse into a divided awareness that could exist without their constant realization. Some even joked about having a silent partner in their own head, one that they could not directly converse with but that occasionally made itself known in curious ways. In the earliest years of observation, one of the most important conclusions was that the split brain condition did not produce a dramatic, disabling fracture of personality or cognition. People could still live independent lives, hold conversations, and make decisions much as they had before. This reassured both the medical community and the public that the surgery, while drastic, was not catastrophic for the patient's sense of self. At the same time, the unique behaviors uncovered by special tests began to inspire profound questions about the unity of consciousness. If the two hemispheres could hold different information at the same time, and if one could act without the other's knowledge, then what exactly was the I that the patient identified with? Was it the speaking left hemisphere, the silent right, or some composite of both? Early split-brain research did not answer these questions definitively, but it established a foundation for decades of philosophical and neuroscientific inquiry. The early clinical observations also highlighted the brain's remarkable adaptability. Even without the corpus callosum, patients often developed strategies to compensate for the loss of direct interhemispheric communication. For example, if the right hemisphere received visual information it could not verbalize, the patient might turn their head or move their eyes so that the left hemisphere could see the same thing. In doing so, they effectively taught one hemisphere what the other already knew, using external cues to bridge the internal divide. This kind of behavioral adaptation was a testament to the flexibility of the human mind, even in the face of profound structural changes. In sum, the first clinical observations painted a picture that was both reassuring and deeply intriguing. The reassuring part was that split-brain patients could function in the world much as they had before, often with dramatic improvements in seizure control and quality of life. The intriguing part was that beneath this surface normalcy lay a world of hidden divisions, where each hemisphere could operate with a degree of independence previously unimaginable. These discoveries mark the beginning of a new era in neuroscience, one in which the very nature of consciousness could be studied by observing minds that had been, in a sense, divided but not destroyed. The early days of split-brain research thus combined medical triumph with scientific curiosity, revealing that behind the unity we take for granted lies a complex partnership between two separate but interdependent halves of the brain. When Roger Sperry and his student Michael Gazzaniga began their now famous series of experiments with split-brain patients in the 1960s, they were stepping into largely uncharted territory. The surgical division of the corpus callosum had been performed to alleviate severe epilepsy, but its deeper implications for cognition and consciousness were still a mystery. Sperry, already interested in the concept of neural specialization from his earlier work with animals, saw in these patients a rare opportunity to investigate how the two hemispheres of the human brain might function when isolated from one another. Gazzaniga, young and ambitious, joined in shaping a research program that would ultimately change how science understands the mind itself. What they found was not simply a reduction in communication between hemispheres, but something far more striking. Each hemisphere, when cut off from the other, could process information independently, almost as if two separate minds were coexisting in a single skull. The cornerstone of their approach was to take advantage of the way the brain processes sensory information. In the visual system, each eye sends information to both hemispheres, but the left visual field of both eyes is processed in the right hemisphere, and the right visual field of both eyes is processed in the left hemisphere. Sperry and Gazzaniga used this fact to design experiments where a stimulus would be flashed on a screen for just a fraction of a second, too quickly for the eyes to move, ensuring that the information would go to only one hemisphere. When a word or image appeared in the right visual field, it was sent to the left hemisphere, which in most people is dominant for language. The patient could readily name the object or describe what they saw. But when the same word or image was presented to the left visual field, thus reaching the right hemisphere, the patient often said they saw nothing at all. This was not because the right hemisphere failed to register the image, but because it lacked the direct language machinery to verbalize its perception. The breakthrough came when the scientists asked the patients to respond in ways that did not require speech. For example, if an image of a key was shown to the left visual field, the right hemisphere received it. While the patient might verbally deny seeing anything, their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, could reach into a bag and unerringly select the key from a set of different objects. This simple but elegant demonstration showed that the right hemisphere had indeed processed the information. It simply could not report it verbally to the experimenter or to the patient's own speaking mind. In another variation, the researchers presented two different images simultaneously, one to each visual field, and then asked the patient to draw what they saw with the left hand. The left hand would produce the image seen by the right hemisphere, even though the patient might verbally insist they had drawn something completely unrelated, the image seen by the left hemisphere. This was a stunning realization. Each hemisphere could take in, store, and act on information without the other being consciously aware of it. As the experiments expanded, Sperry and Gazzaniga found that the independence of the hemispheres extended beyond simple visual perception. They tested tactile perception by placing objects in one hand without letting the patient see them. An object placed in the right hand, connected to the left hemisphere, could be named instantly. Placed in the left hand, it might be described by its texture or function through gestures, but the name would remain elusive unless the patient could shift it to the other hand. They found similar lateralization in motor tasks, problem solving, and even in emotional expression, with each hemisphere capable of initiating responses in ways the other did not fully control. Perhaps most provocative was the evidence that the two hemispheres could hold different beliefs, or make different choices simultaneously. In one experiment, a nude photograph was flashed to the right hemisphere. The patient's face flushed, and they began to giggle, but when asked why they were laughing, the left hemisphere, unaware of the actual stimulus, concocted a plausible but false explanation, such as the machine is making a funny noise. This became a recurring theme. When the two hemispheres received conflicting information, the speaking left hemisphere often tried to rationalize its behavior without realizing it was missing key data. Gazzaniga later coined the term the interpreter to describe this tendency of the left hemisphere to weave coherent narratives out of incomplete information, a function that may play a central role in our sense of self. Over time, the experiments revealed that the right hemisphere was not the mute, secondary partner it was once thought to be. While it lacked the fluent speech abilities of the left, it was adept at recognizing faces, interpreting emotional tone, and processing spatial relationships. It could understand simple written instructions, match patterns, and solve puzzles. In some patients, the right hemisphere could even read and spell short words, though without the same grammatical precision as the left. These capabilities hinted that the right hemisphere had its own form of awareness, different in style from the left, but not necessarily lesser in complexity. The implications of these findings were staggering. Sperry began to argue, with cautious but increasing confidence, that in a split-brain patient there might be two spheres of consciousness, each with its own memories, perceptions, and volition. This was not merely a matter of cognitive specialization. It was a redefinition of what it meant to have a mind. In everyday life, the two hemispheres of a split-brain patient still work together indirectly, often by using environmental cues to pass information back and forth, but under controlled experimental conditions, their separateness could be made starkly visible. This challenged the long-standing assumption that consciousness was inherently unified and indivisible. If two separate streams of thought could exist within one biological individual, what did that mean for the nature of personal identity? These experiments also forced neuroscientists to reconsider the role of the corpus callosum. It was not just a passive conduit, but an active integrator, creating a shared workspace for perception, memory, and intention. Without it, each hemisphere was like a skilled but isolated specialist, capable in its own domain yet unable to access the full richness of the other's expertise. In a sense, the split-brain experiments turned patients into living models of what happens when the brain's most vital communication channel is silenced. The results underscored how much of our normal mental life depends on the constant, invisible conversation between hemispheres. The work of Sperry and Gazzaniga eventually earned Sperry the Nobel Prize in 1981, and it cemented Gazzaniga's reputation as one of the leading figures in cognitive neuroscience. Beyond its medical significance, their research entered the realm of philosophy, inspiring debates about dual consciousness, free will, and the nature of the self. For some philosophers, the split-brain patient became a real-world example of a divided self, where two centers of awareness coexist and sometimes diverge in their intentions. For others, the phenomenon suggested that unity of consciousness might be more fragile or more constructed than previously believed. In retrospect, the genius of their approach lay not in using advanced technology, which was limited at the time, but in the clarity and precision of their behavioral experiments. By carefully controlling which hemisphere received what information and observing the resulting behavior, they exposed the hidden architecture of the mind. The patients themselves, often witty and cooperative, became partners in this exploration, sometimes astonished by what their own brains could do outside the awareness of their speaking selves. Over years of testing, Sperry and Gazzaniga built a body of evidence that fundamentally altered the scientific landscape. showing that the human brain contains not just one stream of thought, but potentially two, each with its own strengths, limitations, and unique window on the world. The idea of two separate consciousnesses was no longer just a speculative metaphor. It had become an observable reality, grounded in careful experimentation and the lived experiences of the patients who embodied it. The human visual system is a masterpiece of biological engineering, but it is also a system full of elegant quirks that reveal much about the organization of the brain. One of the most important of these quirks, and one that became central to the study of split-brain patients, is the way visual information is divided between the two hemispheres. Contrary to what many people assume, it is not that the left eye sends all its information to the left hemisphere and the right eye sends everything to the right hemisphere. Instead, the brain splits the visual world down the middle so that everything in the left half of your field of vision, from both eyes, is processed by the right hemisphere, and everything in the right half is processed by the left hemisphere. This division occurs because of the way nerve fibers from the eyes cross at a structure called the optic chiasm. The result is that each hemisphere of the brain has exclusive access to only one half of the visual field, and this anatomical reality became a powerful tool for neuroscientists trying to understand how the hemispheres work in isolation. In a person with an intact corpus callosum, the fact that each hemisphere gets only half the visual field is barely noticeable. The hemispheres share information instantly, integrating what each sees into a single seamless image of the world. You are not aware that the flower in your left visual field is being processed in one hemisphere and the tree in your right visual field is being processed in the other. The experience is unified and the boundaries are invisible to you. But when the corpus callosum is severed, the natural bridge between the two hemispheres is gone, and this neat division of labor becomes a functional wall. The left hemisphere no longer has direct access to what is in the left visual field, and the right hemisphere no longer has direct access to what is in the right visual field. This creates situations where each hemisphere can have a completely different set of visual data at the same moment. For scientists like Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, this arrangement was an experimental goldmine. By flashing images or words for just a fraction of a second, too quickly for the eyes to move and bring the object into both visual fields, they could ensure that the information went to only one hemisphere. Presenting an image to the right visual field meant it went to the left hemisphere, which in most people houses the language centers. The patient could easily name the object or describe it. Presenting an image to the left visual field meant it went to the right hemisphere, which, although capable of recognizing the object, could not produce speech in most people. The result was often that the patient would insist they saw nothing at all, even though their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, could reach out and select the object from an array without error. This division led to striking and sometimes comical demonstrations. If the word spoon was flashed to the left visual field, the patient might verbally deny seeing any word. But when asked to pick up the corresponding object with their left hand from a pile hidden from view, they would unerringly choose the spoon. The right hemisphere knew exactly what it had seen. It just could not share that knowledge verbally. Conversely, if the word was flashed to the right visual field, the left hemisphere could name it instantly, but the left hand might struggle to pick it out without guidance. In these moments, the separation between what each hemisphere knew was visible to the researchers, and the patients themselves often expressed surprise when told what their other hand had just done. The experiments became even more intriguing when different images were presented simultaneously to each visual field. Suppose the left visual field was shown a picture of a snow scene and the right visual field was shown a picture of a chicken claw. When asked verbally what they saw, the patient would usually report the chicken claw because the left hemisphere, the one with speech, had seen it. But when asked to point to a related object with each hand, the left hand, right hemisphere, might choose a snow shovel, while the right hand, left hemisphere, chose a chicken. If asked why they picked the shovel, the left hemisphere might invent an explanation on the spot, such as, "Oh, you need the shovel to clean out the chicken coop," even though the real reason was that the right hemisphere had seen snow. This revealed not only the separation of visual information, but also the tendency of the left hemisphere to rationalize actions it did not fully understand. These visual field experiments also highlighted the specialized skills of each hemisphere. The right hemisphere, though usually mute, excelled at processing spatial relationships, facial recognition, and certain kinds of pattern recognition. It could identify an object's function or match shapes with remarkable accuracy. The left hemisphere, in contrast, was highly efficient at language, symbolic reasoning, and detailed analysis. This meant that when an object appeared in one visual field, the type of processing it received depended heavily on which hemisphere got the information. An unfamiliar face flashed to the left visual field might be recognized emotionally by the right hemisphere, even if the patient could not name it. A word flashed to the right visual field could be read and interpreted immediately, while the same word in the left visual field might have to be drawn or spelled out letter by letter before recognition was possible. The separation of the visual fields also exposed something profound about our everyday experience of reality. The sense of unity we take for granted is actively constructed by the brain. In split-brain patients, this construction process is disrupted, and the seams of perception become visible. The left hemisphere might be aware of one scene, the right hemisphere of another, and there is no automatic integration between them. Yet in daily life, patients often compensate without realizing it, using eye movements, head turns, and environmental cues to bring information into both visual fields. In a laboratory setting, however, where the visual fields are tightly controlled, the independence of the hemispheres can be made startlingly clear. What makes this phenomenon especially fascinating is that it challenges the intuitive idea that seeing is a single, unified act. In truth, seeing involves two parallel streams of information processing, each capable of operating independently. In most of us, the corpus callosum ensures that these streams merge seamlessly, but in split-brain patients, they remain separate unless the person consciously brings them together. This raises deeper questions about consciousness itself. If each hemisphere has its own visual awareness, does it also have its own subjective point of view? Can two distinct streams of perception coexist without blending into one? The visual field experiments suggest that the answer is yes, at least under certain conditions, and that each hemisphere can act on its own perceptions in ways the other may not even notice. For the patients, these experiments could be both enlightening and unsettling. Some reported that they felt as though part of their awareness was hidden from them, as if one eye belonged to a silent observer who never spoke up. Others were surprised to discover their own hands performing tasks they could not explain. While in everyday life, these phenomena rarely interfered with their functioning, in the controlled conditions of the laboratory, they became impossible to ignore. The split visual fields made it clear that beneath this seamless experience of seeing lies a dual architecture, two hemispheres, two streams of visual information, and, in a sense, two observers inhabiting the same mind. This realization reshaped not only neuroscience's understanding of perception, but also its conception of what it means to be aware of the world at all. One of the most striking consequences of severing the corpus callosum is the emergence of a visible asymmetry in speech and motor control, revealing just how much the left and right hemispheres differ in their capabilities. In most right-handed individuals, language production is localized in the left hemisphere, particularly in regions such as Broca's area and Wernicke's area. This specialization means that when visual or sensory information is delivered exclusively to the right hemisphere, such as when it appears in the left visual field, it cannot be directly expressed through speech. The right hemisphere may recognize what it perceives, may even respond nonverbally, but without the left hemisphere's language apparatus, it remains silent. In the intact brain, this limitation is invisible because the corpus callosum allows the right hemisphere to pass its information to the left for verbalization. After the connection is severed, however, this bridge is gone, and the patient's ability to name objects, describe events, or explain actions becomes dependent on which hemisphere received the input. This arrangement produces situations that, to an outside observer, can seem almost like a glitch in a computer program. A patient might look at an object placed in their left hand while their eyes are closed and be entirely unable to say what it is. They might frown in frustration, clearly sensing familiarity, but the word will not come. If, however, they are allowed to draw the object with the same hand, the right hemisphere's motor control can guide them to create an accurate picture, a spoon, a key, a comb, without a single verbal clue. If the object is instead placed in their right hand, the left hemisphere's control over both speech and motor output ensures that they can immediately name it. What appears at first to be a simple naming problem is, in reality, a profound disconnection between perception and expression, one that highlights how language is not evenly distributed across the brain. Motor control itself is similarly lateralized. Each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. The left hemisphere governs the right arm and leg, while the right hemisphere controls the left arm and leg. In everyday life, these two systems coordinate effortlessly, allowing for smooth, symmetrical movements, typing on a keyboard, playing a piano, tying shoelaces. But in split-brain patients, where the hemispheres cannot directly share planning and execution strategies, these actions can become unexpectedly complicated. The left hand might act on information the right hemisphere has, but the left hemisphere does not, while the right hand follows instructions that the left hemisphere can verbalize. This mismatch can result in moments where the two hands seem to work at cross purposes, each following its own plan without regard for the other. Some of the most famous cases from split-brain research describe intermanual conflict, a phenomenon in which the two hands literally appear to be arguing. A patient might be buttoning a shirt with the right hand, while the left hand simultaneously unbuttons it. In one documented case, a patient attempted to pick out clothes with the right hand, while the left hand chose entirely different ones, as if disagreeing with the decision. These episodes were not acts of conscious defiance, but the natural outcome of two independent motor control systems receiving different information and priorities. The left hemisphere's hand might be responding to verbal instructions or conscious planning, while the right hemisphere's hand reacted to visual cues or intuitive preferences it could not articulate. Without the corpus callosum to reconcile these impulses, both were free to act simultaneously, sometimes with comical or frustrating results. In conversation, the asymmetry of speech can also produce curious outcomes. If a word or picture is presented to the right visual field, the left hemisphere's language center can respond fluently. If the same stimulus is shown to the left visual field, the patient may verbally deny having seen anything, even though their left hand can indicate the correct choice from an array. This is not a deliberate deception. It is simply that the hemisphere responsible for speaking does not have access to the information. In some cases, patients have been trained to use alternative communication channels, such as spelling out words with their left hand on a board, allowing the right hemisphere to speak in a roundabout way. These methods revealed that the right hemisphere, though usually mute, often had a surprisingly rich understanding of the world and could respond intelligently when given the means. Daily life for a split-brain patient is not usually as dramatically divided as these laboratory situations suggest, because most tasks involve both visual fields, both hands, and ample time for compensatory strategies. Still, the underlying division can surface in subtle ways. A person might struggle to describe an object glimpsed only peripherally on the left, needing to turn their head to bring it into the right visual field before they can name it. They might favor their right hand for tasks that require verbal coordination, such as cooking while following spoken instructions, and their left hand for tasks that benefit from spatial reasoning or pattern recognition. Over time, many patients develop an intuitive awareness of which side of the brain is better suited for which activities, even if they cannot consciously explain why. The separation of speech and motor control also forces us to reconsider how we think about agency and the unity of the self. When one hemisphere initiates an action that the other cannot explain, who is in control? The left hemisphere, with its language and reasoning abilities, often acts as the narrator of a person's life, weaving a coherent story out of actions and events. But in split-brain patients, this narrator sometimes finds itself confronted with actions it did not plan and must invent explanations after the fact. This confabulation is not deceitful. It is simply how the left hemisphere operates, filling in gaps to preserve the illusion of a single, unified will. The right hemisphere, meanwhile, may be quietly influencing choices, guiding the left hand, or reacting emotionally in ways the verbal half of the brain cannot account for. From a neurological perspective, the fact that each hemisphere can carry out complex motor sequences independently is not surprising. The two sides of the brain evolved to control opposite halves of the body for efficiency and redundancy. What is surprising is how well they usually cooperate and how little we notice the division under normal conditions. The split-brain condition peels back the curtain on this cooperation, showing us that unity is not the default but the result of constant, silent communication across the corpus callosum. Without that bridge, the independence of each hemisphere becomes visible not only in controlled experiments, but, occasionally, in the flow of everyday life. This interplay of speech and motor control has broader implications for our understanding of consciousness. If one hemisphere can perceive, plan, and act without the other's knowledge, then consciousness itself may not be a single spotlight illuminating the entire mind, but a network of localized beams, each aware of its own domain. In split-brain patients, these beams no longer overlap perfectly, and the resulting pattern reveals the architecture beneath the surface. Language, for all its power, is just one such beam, dominant in shaping our self-concept, but not the sole arbiter of experience. The mute right hemisphere, with its own perceptions and motor capabilities, reminds us that much of what we do is guided by parts of the mind that remain silent yet active, invisible yet essential. In this way, the study of split speech and motor control is not just an exploration of neurological oddities, but a direct challenge to our everyday assumptions about unity, control, and the seamlessness of our own minds. By watching hands disagree and words falter, we glimpse the truth that the brain is less a single command center and more a coalition, usually harmonious, sometimes divided, always intricate. In the world of split-brain research, some of the most fascinating and unsettling accounts come from cases in which the two hemispheres seem to act in direct opposition to each other, as if there were two minds with competing agendas sharing the same body. These interhemispheric conflicts manifest most visibly through the hands, since each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body, and without the corpus callosum to coordinate them, each can pursue its own goals independently. What might appear, from the outside, like clumsiness or indecision, can in fact be the outward expression of a silent tug-of-war between two centers of will, each informed by different perceptions, intentions, and priorities. For many patients, these moments are rare, emerging only under certain conditions, but when they do occur, they offer an extraordinary glimpse into the divided nature of the brain. One of the most famous types of interhemispheric conflict is known as alien hand syndrome, in which one hand seems to take on a life of its own, performing actions the person does not consciously intend. In split-brain patients, the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, is most often the alien hand, since the speaking left hemisphere is the one that reports conscious intention, and the right hemisphere cannot explain itself verbally. A patient might find their left hand closing a drawer just after the right hand has opened it, or unbuttoning a shirt that the right hand is busily fastening. Sometimes the left hand will reach out to pick up an object the right hand has just put down, or even take something away from the right hand entirely. To an observer, these moments can be comical, almost like a slapstick routine. To the patient, they can be frustrating, even distressing, because they reveal that not all movement flows from a single, unified command. In documented cases, these hand conflicts can extend beyond simple physical interference to actions that reflect differing motivations between hemispheres. One patient, for example, described trying to select clothes in the morning only to have the left hand consistently pull different garments from the closet than the right hand chose. Another patient, asked to pick up a preferred object from a set, would have the right hand comply with the spoken instructions while the left hand reached for a different object entirely, reflecting the right hemisphere's own preference. Without the corpus callosum to reconcile these choices, both sets of instructions, one verbal and conscious from the left hemisphere, the other nonverbal and intuitive from the right, could be executed in parallel, resulting in a physical manifestation of disagreement. The conflict can also appear when one hemisphere is reacting to visual information the other does not possess. Because each hemisphere receives input from the opposite visual field, a stimulus presented only to the left visual field reaches only the right hemisphere. In a split-brain patient, that information cannot cross over to the left hemisphere's speech centers. If a task is set up so that each hemisphere is given a different visual cue, one in the left visual field, one in the right, they may each attempt to act on their own cue. This can produce striking behavior, such as each hand drawing a different image at the same time, or one hand beginning an action while the other disrupts it because it has been prompted to do something else. In such experiments, the patient is not consciously aware of the reason for the conflict. They experience it only as a kind of internal interference, like trying to follow two contradictory sets of instructions at once. Interestingly, these conflicts do not always present as aggressive competition. In some cases, the two hemispheres seem to work toward different but equally valid goals, almost as though they were two people with divergent interests sharing the same body. One hemisphere might prioritize neatness, the other spontaneity. One might focus on immediate sensory pleasure, the other on long-term planning. The result is not necessarily chaos, but a subtle undermining of efficiency and coherence. For example, a patient might begin making a sandwich with the right hand while the left hand quietly tidies up the counter, putting away ingredients before they are used. To the observer, this might look like forgetfulness. In reality, it may be a sign that the two hemispheres are not in full agreement about the task at hand. When these conflicts are more overt, they can provoke strong emotional reactions. Some patients report feelings of irritation or helplessness when their left hand misbehaves, while others develop coping strategies, such as physically holding the uncooperative hand with the other to prevent interference. Over time, many learn to anticipate potential conflicts and arrange their environment to minimize them, placing important objects in the right visual field to ensure the left hemisphere, with its verbal reasoning abilities, is the one making decisions, or using by manual tasks sparingly to avoid situations where the two sides might compete. Researchers studying these cases have noted that the conflict is not constant. Most of the time, the hemispheres appear to operate in harmony, thanks to indirect communication pathways and learned compensations. But under the right experimental conditions, or in daily life when attention is divided, the underlying independence of each hemisphere becomes apparent. These moments remind us that cooperation between hemispheres is not automatic, but actively maintained through neural connections that, when severed, reveal the separate streams of processing beneath the surface of consciousness. There is also a deeper, more philosophical dimension to these stories. If the right and left hemispheres can form conflicting intentions, then the idea of a singular self directing the body begins to seem less certain. Instead, it may be more accurate to think of the self as an emergent property of interhemispheric communication, a negotiated agreement between two partially autonomous systems. In a healthy brain, this negotiation is so seamless that it feels like a single will. In a split-brain patient, the negotiation table is gone, and the separate voices may speak or act at cross purposes. The phenomenon of the two hands disagreeing is thus more than a curiosity. It is evidence that unity of action and unity of consciousness are both products of ongoing integration, not inherent givens. What makes these cases even more remarkable is that patients often report feeling as if the alien hand is not theirs during moments of conflict, even though they can see and feel it moving. This sense of disownership underscores the fact that our perception of control is tied not only to movement, but to intention and awareness. If a movement is initiated outside the conscious domain of the speaking hemisphere, it can feel foreign, even threatening, despite originating within the same brain. This subjective experience, combined with the objective reality of competing actions, creates one of the clearest windows into the dual nature of the human mind. Over decades of observation, the collected stories of hands that button and unbutton, that grab and release, that agree and disagree, have built a picture of the brain as a partnership rather than a monarchy. The corpus callosum is the treaty that keeps the partners in sync, allowing them to share plans, goals, and perceptions. When that treaty is dissolved, the partners do not always fight, but when they do, the conflict can be visible in every gesture. These moments are rare, unpredictable, and deeply revealing, offering a living demonstration that beneath the calm surface of our everyday movements lies the potential for two separate wills, each capable of steering the body in its own direction. The human brain is a structure of remarkable symmetry in its appearance, with two hemispheres that look, at first glance, almost like mirror images of one another. Yet beneath this symmetry lies a deep asymmetry in function, a phenomenon known as lateralization. Lateralization refers to the tendency for certain cognitive processes to be more specialized in one hemisphere than the other, a division of labor that allows the brain to process information more efficiently. This division is not absolute. Both hemispheres participate in nearly every task, but patterns emerge when one looks closely at how language, spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and other abilities are distributed between the left and right halves of the brain. Perhaps the most well-known of these is the dominance of the left hemisphere in language-related tasks, while the right hemisphere often takes the lead in spatial awareness and the recognition of patterns. The left hemisphere's association with language was first recognized in the 19th century through the work of neurologists such as Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke. Broca's observations of patients who could understand speech but were unable to produce fluent speech led him to identify a region in the left frontal lobe, now known as Broca's area, as critical for speech production. Wernicke's work, meanwhile, pointed to an area in the left temporal lobe essential for language comprehension. These discoveries solidified the idea that, for most right-handed people, and even for many left-handed individuals, language is strongly lateralized to the left hemisphere. This includes not only speaking and understanding words, but also reading, writing, and much of the grammatical and syntactic processing that underlies communication. While the right hemisphere can contribute to certain aspects of language, particularly tone, intonation, and the emotional content of speech, it is the left hemisphere that serves as the primary engine for generating and decoding linguistic meaning. The reasons for this lateralization are still a matter of scientific investigation, but several hypotheses have been proposed. One possibility is that concentrating language functions in one hemisphere reduces the need for constant interhemispheric communication, thereby speeding up processing. Another is that the structural organization of the left hemisphere, with its denser networks of short-range connections, is better suited for the fine-grained, sequential processing that language demands. Language involves the rapid assembly of sounds into words, words into sentences, and sentences into coherent ideas. Such linear, ordered processing may align naturally with the computational style of the left hemisphere. In contrast, the right hemisphere tends to excel at tasks that involve holistic processing, pattern recognition, and spatial awareness. This includes the ability to understand three-dimensional relationships, navigate through space, and interpret complex visual scenes. The right hemisphere plays a dominant role in recognizing faces, reading maps, judging distances, and perceiving geometric relationships. These abilities rely on integrating multiple streams of sensory input into a unified spatial representation, something the right hemisphere seems particularly well equipped to do. It can rapidly grasp the overall structure of a visual pattern, detect similarities or anomalies in shapes, and process spatial relationships in a way that does not depend on sequential analysis. One striking aspect of this division is that the strengths of each hemisphere complement each other. The left hemisphere's facility with detail-oriented, sequential processing pairs with the right hemisphere's capacity for global, integrative perception. In everyday life, these specializations work together seamlessly. When reading a sentence, for example, the left hemisphere parses the syntax and meaning of the words, while the right hemisphere may be attuned to the rhythm, emphasis, and overall tone, as well as the imagery evoked by the text. When navigating a city, the right hemisphere constructs a mental map of the environment, while the left hemisphere may keep track of verbal directions and street names. This cooperative interplay means that most cognitive tasks are not purely the domain of one hemisphere, but instead reflect a division of labor in which each contributes its strengths. The specialization of hemispheres has also been revealed through the study of split-brain patients. When visual information is presented only to the right hemisphere, these patients may be able to draw an image or point to a related object, but cannot verbally name it, since the right hemisphere in most people lacks direct access to the speech centers in the left hemisphere. Conversely, when information is presented only to the left hemisphere, the patient can name it easily, but may struggle to capture its spatial relationships in a drawing. Such experiments underscore the distinct cognitive styles of the two hemispheres, with the left leaning toward verbal analytical processing and the right toward visuospatial holistic processing. Pattern recognition, while often associated with the right hemisphere, is an ability that spans many domains, and the type of pattern matters for determining which hemisphere takes the lead. The right hemisphere is particularly adept at recognizing visual and auditory patterns that are global or relational in nature, such as the melody of a song, the symmetry of a design, or the overall configuration of a face. The left hemisphere, however, can be more effective at recognizing patterns that are sequential or rule-based, such as grammatical structures in language or mathematical sequences. This suggests that lateralization is not so much about content as about the style of processing. The left hemisphere specializes in analysis based on sequence and order, while the right hemisphere specializes in synthesis based on spatial and relational cues. The lateralization of function is not fixed from birth, but develops over time, influenced by genetic, environmental, and experiential factors. In cases where the dominant hemisphere is damaged early in life, the other hemisphere can often take over many of its functions, a phenomenon known as neuroplasticity. For example, children who suffer left hemisphere damage before the age of 5 may still develop normal language skills, as the right hemisphere reorganizes itself to handle these tasks. This plasticity diminishes with age, however, and in adults, damage to the dominant hemisphere for language often results in long-lasting deficits such as aphasia. This developmental flexibility shows that lateralization is not an immutable rule, but rather an adaptive strategy the brain uses for efficiency, one that becomes more fixed as neural pathways solidify. It is important to dispel the common myth that people can be classified as left-brained or right-brained in terms of personality or intelligence. While there is some truth to the idea that the hemispheres have different processing styles, nearly all complex behaviors involve contributions from both sides. Creativity, for instance, is not purely a right hemisphere function. It requires the left hemisphere's analytical abilities to structure and refine ideas, as well as the right hemisphere's holistic perception to generate novel associations. Similarly, logical reasoning is not confined to the left hemisphere, as many aspects of problem-solving benefit from the right hemisphere's capacity for visualizing possibilities and recognizing non-obvious patterns. The evolutionary origins of lateralization remain an open question, but many scientists believe it offers a survival advantage by allowing the brain to perform multiple types of processing simultaneously without interference. In other animals, lateralization is also common. Songbirds, for example, often process song patterns predominantly in one hemisphere, while using the other for spatial navigation. This suggests that lateralization is not a uniquely human adaptation, but part of a broader evolutionary trend toward functional specialization within the brain. Ultimately, the dominance of the left hemisphere for language and the right for spatial awareness is less about strict boundaries and more about statistical tendencies. There are exceptions. Some left-handed individuals have language dominance in the right hemisphere, and some cognitive functions are more evenly distributed. Yet the broad pattern holds in most people, shaping the way we perceive, think, and interact with the world. The interplay of these specializations gives rise to the richness of human cognition, ensuring that we can not only analyze the details of a sentence, but also appreciate the shape of a landscape, recognize a familiar face in a crowd, or detect the subtle harmony in a piece of music. The two hemispheres, each with its own strengths, work in concert to produce this seamless unity of experience we take for granted, even though it is built on a foundation of asymmetry. The human experience is rooted in a profound and seemingly obvious assumption that we are a single, unified self, an I that perceives, decides, feels, and acts as one coherent entity. We rarely question this sense of unity because it is constant and immersive, woven into every waking moment and even much of our dreaming life. Yet neuroscience has shown that beneath this unbroken stream of consciousness lies an intricate and sometimes fractured reality. The brain is not a monolithic organ processing all thoughts and sensations in one central place. It is a vast network of specialized regions and systems, many of which can operate in parallel and even in partial independence. The fact that these distributed processes somehow give rise to a single, unified perspective is one of the most remarkable feats of neural architecture and one of the great mysteries of cognitive science. In the context of split-brain research, the illusion of a unified self becomes particularly striking. Patients who have undergone corpus callosotomy, in which the major fiber tract connecting the two hemispheres is severed, often continue to feel entirely whole in their day-to-day lives. They do not walk around feeling like two people sharing one skull. They continue to speak, act, and think in a way that seems completely continuous. Yet under certain experimental conditions, the independence of the hemispheres can be unmasked. When information is delivered to only one hemisphere, by presenting images to just the left or right visual field, the two sides of the brain can respond differently, sometimes even contradicting each other. One hemisphere might identify an object verbally, while the other, unable to speak, selects a different object with the hand it controls. From the outside, it can appear as though there are two minds at work, each with its own knowledge and preferences. And yet, to the patient's subjective awareness, there is still just one me. This paradox points to the brain's ability to create a seamless narrative from disparate inputs. The left hemisphere, which in most people houses language, appears to play a particularly important role in generating this sense of coherence. Some neuroscientists, most famously Michael Gazzaniga, have described the left hemisphere as an interpreter, a mechanism that takes the available information and weaves it into a plausible story about our experiences, even if that information is incomplete or contradictory. This interpreter function explains why split-brain patients, when confronted with actions initiated by the nonverbal right hemisphere, often confabulate explanations. For example, if the right hemisphere causes the left hand to perform an action and the left hemisphere is unaware of the true cause, the speaking mind will still invent a reason, as though it had been in control all along. In doing so, the interpreter maintains the illusion of unity, preserving the continuity of self. This tendency is not unique to people with split brains. It is a feature of all human minds. Even in neurologically intact individuals, many processes occur outside of conscious awareness, and the conscious self learns about them only after the fact. Decisions can be initiated subconsciously before we become aware of making them. Emotional reactions can arise in milliseconds, shaping perception and judgment before we have time to reflect. Motor actions can be triggered by reflex pathways that bypass conscious intention, yet in most cases, we feel as though we were fully in control, as if every thought and movement originated from a single, central command center. This is the brain's narrative machinery at work, stitching together a coherent account from the complex, decentralized reality of neural processing. The sensation of unity is further supported by the brain's integration of sensory information. Every second, billions of bits of data stream in from the eyes, ears, skin, muscles, and internal organs. These signals are processed in specialized regions, each attuned to particular kinds of information. Visual processing alone is divided into multiple pathways for color, motion, depth, and object recognition, and auditory processing separates pitch from rhythm and spatial location. Yet all of these channels converge into a single perceptual field in our awareness. We do not experience isolated patches of color, disjointed sounds, or uncoordinated movements. We experience a unified world populated by coherent objects and events. The brain achieves this integration by aligning and binding information across regions, aided by neural synchrony and constant crosstalk between networks. Even when the hemispheres are disconnected, each side retains enough of its own integrative capacity to create a complete experience, and the dominant hemisphere's narrative abilities smooth over the discrepancies. Philosophically, the existence of this illusion challenges common ideas about the self. If consciousness can be split without the subject feeling split, then the I may be less of a fixed entity and more of a construction, a model the brain maintains for the sake of coordination and decision-making. From this perspective, the self is a useful fiction, a kind of internal brand identity that unifies the actions of a distributed system. This fictional self is incredibly adaptive, allowing the organism to act in ways that are coherent and goal-directed even when different subsystems have partially divergent priorities. It is not that the self is unreal in the sense of being imaginary. Rather, it is a product of information processing, as much a creation of the brain as perception or memory. The illusion of unity also has emotional and social dimensions. Humans are social animals, and much of our behavior depends on communicating and collaborating with others. A fractured or inconsistent self would make it difficult to build trust or maintain relationships. The brain's narrative unity ensures that we can present a stable persona to the world, even when our internal processing is anything but stable. This stability is maintained not only in normal brain function, but also in cases of injury or disease, as the interpreter works to smooth over disruptions in perception, memory, or agency. People with amnesia, for example, often fill in gaps in their memory with plausible but invented details, not out of deception, but as part of the brain's drive to maintain a coherent self-narrative. At the same time, the illusion is not perfect. Under certain conditions, neurological damage, psychiatric disorders, or experimental manipulation, it can break down. Dissociative identity disorder, for instance, presents a dramatic case where the sense of a unified self fragments into multiple identities, each with its own memories and behaviors. In less extreme cases, people may feel a sense of detachment from themselves, as in depersonalization, or experience conflicting impulses that they cannot reconcile. These phenomena reveal that unity is an achievement, not a given, and that the brain's integrative work is ongoing and sometimes fragile. In everyday life, however, the machinery of unity is so effective that we take it for granted. Whether we are engaging in conversation, solving a problem, or simply walking down the street, we move through the world with the deep conviction that there is a single me at the center of it all. This conviction is not diminished by the fact that, neurologically speaking, it is an illusion. If anything, recognizing the constructed nature of the self deepens the mystery of consciousness. How does a collection of neural processes, each with its own scope and limitations, converge into the feeling of being one person? How can multiple centers of awareness, like those revealed in split-brain patients, operate without shattering that feeling? These questions remain open, but they point toward an understanding of the self as an emergent property of the brain's need to integrate, interpret, and coordinate its own activity. The illusion of a unified self, then, is both a triumph of biological engineering and a reminder of the brain's complexity. It shows us that what we take to be the most fundamental fact of our existence, that we are singular, indivisible beings, rests on a delicate balance of distributed processes and interpretive strategies. This balance can be disturbed, revealing the multiplicity that lies beneath, but under ordinary conditions it holds firm, guiding us through life with the comforting sense that all of our perceptions, thoughts, and actions belong to one continuous stream of consciousness. In truth, we are not a single point in the brain but a chorus of neural voices, harmonized so skillfully that we hear only one song. When the idea of communicating with each hemisphere of a split brain separately was first seriously considered, It seemed almost like science fiction. The brain is encased in the skull, its hemispheres hidden deep beneath layers of bone and tissue, connected by a dense network of fibers that in healthy individuals operate as a single unit. Yet in patients who have undergone a complete or partial corpus callosotomy, that central bridge of communication is cut, meaning information presented to one hemisphere cannot easily cross to the other. Neuropsychologists quickly realized that with the right experimental setup, they could use this disconnection to access each side of the brain independently, almost like interviewing two people who happen to live in the same head. The development of these tests required a deep understanding of sensory and motor pathways, as well as careful control of how stimuli are presented, because the brain's wiring is very specific about which hemisphere receives which kind of information. The most famous and versatile of these approaches relies on the organization of the visual system. Light entering the eyes does not simply send a duplicate image to each hemisphere. Instead, the visual field is divided vertically down the middle. Information from the left visual field of both eyes travels to the right hemisphere, while information from the right visual field goes to the left hemisphere. This anatomical fact becomes the core of split brain testing. By having a patient fixate on a central point on a screen, researchers can briefly present images either to the left or right of that point. If an image appears in the right visual field, it will be processed first by the left hemisphere, which in most people is also the side responsible for speech production. The patient can then name or describe the object normally. However, if the image is shown to the left visual field, it is processed by the right hemisphere, which in split-brain patients often cannot directly communicate with the language centers in the left hemisphere. In that case, the patient may insist they saw nothing at all, even though the right hemisphere clearly received and processed the information. The cleverness of these tests becomes apparent when researchers add motor responses. The left hemisphere controls movements of the right side of the body, while the right hemisphere controls the left side. So, if an image is shown to the left visual field and thus processed by the right hemisphere, the patient may be unable to name it verbally, but could use their left hand to select the correct object from a group placed out of sight. This dissociation between what can be spoken and what can be acted upon is a hallmark of split brain testing and provides a direct way to hear the voice of the hemisphere that cannot speak. Researchers have developed a range of variations on this basic setup to explore different domains of function. In some experiments, words are flashed to a single visual field for just a fraction of a second, too quickly for the eyes to move and bring the stimulus into the other hemisphere's processing zone. The patient may be able to read and repeat the word if it is sent to the left hemisphere, but when it is sent to the right hemisphere, the response might be a puzzled denial, unless the patient is allowed to draw it with the left hand, at which point the meaning emerges. Other tests use pictures, patterns, or even abstract shapes, allowing scientists to explore how each hemisphere handles language, spatial reasoning, and object recognition. For example, the right hemisphere is often better at recognizing faces and processing spatial layouts. So if a complex scene is shown to that side, it may be easier for the patient to reproduce it with the left hand than to describe it aloud. Auditory testing is more complex, because the pathways from the ears to the brain are less strictly crossed than the visual system. Sounds from one ear are sent to both hemispheres, although there is a stronger projection to the opposite side. To isolate hemispheric processing in hearing, neuropsychologists sometimes use dichotic listening tasks. In this method, different sounds, such as spoken syllables, are played simultaneously to each ear through headphones. Because of the way auditory pathways are organized, the sound presented to the right ear is generally processed more efficiently by the left hemisphere, and the sound to the left ear by the right hemisphere. When asked to repeat what they hear, Most people are better at reporting the right ear stimulus, a phenomenon known as the right ear advantage. In split-brain patients, this asymmetry can be exaggerated, and researchers can use it to probe how each hemisphere processes language and nonverbal sounds. Tactile testing provides another route to isolated hemisphere communication. By blindfolding the patient and placing objects into one hand at a time, scientists can feed sensory information directly to the opposite hemisphere. If the right hand is used, the left hemisphere receives the touch input and the patient can usually name the object easily. If the left hand is used, the right hemisphere gets the information and verbal naming often fails. But the patient may still be able to select the correct object by feel alone or draw it without seeing it. This method is particularly useful for studying the nonverbal hemisphere's capacity for object recognition, memory, and even problem solving. For example, some experiments place puzzle pieces in the left hand and test how efficiently the right hemisphere can assemble them compared to the verbal left hemisphere using the right hand. Beyond these basic sensory motor paradigms, neuropsychologists have created more elaborate tasks to explore decision-making, emotion, and reasoning in each hemisphere separately. Emotional reactions can be especially telling. Presenting emotionally charged images to just one visual field may produce a measurable change in facial expression controlled by the hemisphere that received the image. Because facial muscles are partly crossed in their neural control, the expression might appear more strongly on one side of the face, revealing the hemisphere's reaction even if the patient cannot verbalize it. This kind of subtle testing has shown that the right hemisphere often has a stronger role in processing emotional content, particularly negative emotions. Some of the most intriguing tests involve giving each hemisphere conflicting commands or goals. For example, an instruction flash to the left visual field might tell the right hemisphere to perform one task with the left hand, while a different instruction flash to the right visual field tells the left hemisphere to perform another task with the right hand. In some cases, the two hands may begin to work against each other, each carrying out its own plan. By observing and recording these moments, scientists can study how each hemisphere prioritizes, adapts, or concedes in the face of conflict, shedding light on the balance of autonomy and cooperation within the divided brain. The ingenuity of these neuropsychological tests lies in their ability to bypass the everyday illusion of unity that most split-brain patients experience. In conversation and daily activity, both hemispheres tend to work in parallel, and the dominant verbal hemisphere often interprets events as though it were always in control. The experimental setups strip away that interpretive layer, delivering stimuli in ways that isolate processing streams before they can be integrated. In doing so, they reveal the independent strengths, weaknesses, and preferences of each hemisphere. The results are not only fascinating from a theoretical perspective, but also profoundly informative for understanding brain organization more generally. They demonstrate that much of what we think of as a singular mind is actually the coordination of multiple, partially autonomous systems, each capable of perceiving, remembering, and deciding on its own. Even in the absence of a corpus callosum, these systems still share some information through smaller commissural pathways or through indirect behavioral cues, so the separation is rarely absolute. But the degree of independence shown in testing underscores how much of our mental life depends on the seamless communication between hemispheres. When that bridge is cut, the duality of the brain comes into focus, and through careful, methodical testing, science can, in a sense, hold two separate conversations within one head. This has reshaped not only neuroscience, but also our philosophical understanding of consciousness, identity, and the architecture of the human mind. Life after split-brain surgery unfolds in a way that is both surprisingly ordinary and subtly extraordinary. For many patients, the first and most striking realization is that their day-to-day life is not completely disrupted. They wake up, talk, walk, and perform routine tasks much as they did before, and family members often remark that the person seems essentially the same. This surface continuity can be deceptive because beneath the smooth appearance of normality, the brain is now operating under a new set of rules. The corpus callosum, once the main highway for transferring information between hemispheres, has been severed, and the two halves of the brain now communicate only through slower, less direct routes, or not at all for certain types of information. Patients must gradually discover, often without consciously realizing it, how to adapt to the quirks that this division introduces. The first weeks or months after surgery are often marked by relief for those who underwent the procedure to control severe epilepsy. The violent, disabling seizures that once dominated their lives may be dramatically reduced or vanish entirely. This change alone can feel transformative, offering a degree of independence and safety that had been impossible before. Yet, alongside this relief, some patients notice peculiar changes in perception and coordination, especially when tasks require both hemispheres to share complex information. For example, a patient might be able to read a word normally when looking straight at it, but if the word is flashed to just one side of their visual field, they may find themselves strangely unable to name it, even though they can draw it from memory. These moments can be disconcerting at first, but many learn to shrug them off or develop subtle compensations, such as moving their eyes slightly to bring an image into the hemisphere that can verbalize it. Coordination between the hands can also feel subtly altered. While gross motor tasks like lifting a box or typing are usually unaffected, more complex bimanual activities sometimes reveal the independent inclinations of each hemisphere. A patient tying their shoes might notice one hand moving in a way that feels unexpectedly awkward or even counterproductive. In rare cases, one hand might start to undo what the other has done, a phenomenon sometimes called intermanual conflict. Though this is often mild and fleeting, patients who experience it learn small behavioral strategies to keep both hands aligned, such as focusing more intently on the task or physically repositioning objects so that one hand has less opportunity to interfere. Emotionally, the impact varies. Some patients report no noticeable change in mood or personality, while others sense a subtle shift in their emotional responses. The right hemisphere plays a large role in processing emotions, especially negative or complex feelings, and when its perceptions cannot be easily shared with the left hemisphere's verbal centers, certain emotional states may feel more diffuse or harder to articulate. A patient might feel uneasy without being able to explain why, or might struggle to put into words a sudden flash of sadness or joy triggered by a stimulus presented to the nonverbal side of the brain. Over time, many develop a kind of internal translation process, where they use bodily cues, facial expressions, or simple descriptive language to convey what they feel, even if the feeling originated in the hemisphere that cannot speak. One unexpected advantage that some split-brain patients describe is a heightened ability to focus on tasks without interference from competing thoughts. Because each hemisphere is processing its own stream of information more independently, it can sometimes feel as though distractions are reduced, especially when one hemisphere is engaged in a task and the other is not feeding in conflicting inputs. In controlled experiments, some patients have even demonstrated the ability to perform two tasks at once more effectively than people with intact brains, because each hemisphere can handle a different job simultaneously without the need for constant integration. In everyday life, this might translate into being able to draw with one hand while writing with the other, or to hum a tune while reading, with less mutual disruption. Social interactions can also carry subtle changes. Because the verbal hemisphere often dominates outward communication, the nonverbal hemisphere's reactions may not always be fully represented in speech. Friends and family sometimes notice that the patient seems less verbally responsive to certain emotional cues, even though the person's facial expressions or gestures still reflect genuine feeling. In conversations, the patient might pause longer before answering, as if their brain is doing extra behind-the-scenes work to consolidate perceptions from both halves. Yet many patients become adept at bridging this gap unconsciously, adjusting their speech patterns or using humor to mask small processing delays. One of the more intriguing aspects of adaptation is that most split-brain patients are not constantly aware of having two minds. The dominant hemisphere's interpreter function tends to weave experiences into a coherent narrative, smoothing over the inconsistencies that arise from hemispheric separation. As a result, patients often do not notice the moments when their other hemisphere processes something differently or independently. These moments become more apparent only in structured testing, when stimuli are carefully presented to one hemisphere alone. In daily life, the eyes and body move, the environment changes, and small shifts in gaze or posture often bring critical information into both hemispheres' awareness, minimizing the separation. Practical challenges do arise, particularly in academic or work settings that demand rapid integration of verbal and visual spatial information. Tasks like copying diagrams, solving complex math problems, or interpreting charts can take longer because the hemisphere that processes the spatial layout may not be the same one controlling the verbal explanation. Patients may adapt by breaking tasks into smaller steps, using written notes, or relying on visual aids that keep both types of information in view simultaneously. Over time, many become highly skilled at these workarounds, to the point where casual observers would never guess their brains are physically divided. The subjective experience of consciousness after surgery remains a deeply personal and variable matter. Some patients report no change at all in how they experience their own thoughts and identity, while others speak of a subtle sense of dual awareness, fleeting impressions that one part of their mind knows or feels something the other does not. These impressions are usually not disruptive and may even fade as the person grows accustomed to their brain's new configuration. A small number of patients find these moments fascinating and learn to check in with each hemisphere intentionally, for example by testing each hand's knowledge of an object or allowing themselves to respond non-verbally to certain stimuli just to see what happens. Ultimately, life after split-brain surgery is often a story of quiet adaptation. The surgery may be dramatic in its nature and its implications for neuroscience, but for the individual, the most lasting effects are usually not the exotic, laboratory-demonstrated phenomena of two separate consciousnesses. Instead, they are the practical adjustments that allow a person to live well, work, maintain relationships, and enjoy activities free from the seizures or other neurological problems that prompted the operation in the first place. The brain, even when divided, is remarkably plastic, and it finds ways to compensate, reroute, and reorganize. For most patients, this means they can live not as someone with a broken or incomplete mind, but as someone whose mind simply works along a slightly different set of lines, often invisible except to themselves and the scientists who study them. The question of whether two distinct persons can exist within one head after the severing of the corpus callosum is not only a scientific inquiry, but also a deeply philosophical and ethical one. It touches on our most fundamental assumptions about what it means to be an individual, where consciousness begins and ends, and how identity is defined. When neuroscientists discovered that the two hemispheres of a split-brain patient could process information independently and sometimes even appear to have separate preferences, reactions, or knowledge, it forced a reconsideration of the unity of the self. In ordinary life, consciousness feels singular. There is one I that experiences thoughts, emotions, and sensations. Yet the split brain condition suggests that this unity might be, at least partly, a construction, a convenient illusion that breaks down when the bridge between hemispheres is cut. The ethical implications begin with the possibility that two centers of awareness might coexist in the same skull, each with its own perceptions, intentions, and perhaps even a rudimentary sense of self. If that is true, are both entitled to be recognized as persons? In a courtroom, for example, if the verbal hemisphere makes a decision or commits an act, but the nonverbal hemisphere did not consent or even know about it, can responsibility still be attributed to the person as a whole? Our legal systems are built on the idea of a unitary agent, someone who can be held accountable for their actions because they are the same person from moment to moment. If split-brain patients challenge that assumption, then certain cases could, in theory, demand a re-evaluation of moral and legal responsibility. Some philosophers argue that even if each hemisphere can process information independently, the resulting two minds do not meet the threshold for two fully fledged persons. A person, in this view, requires not only separate streams of perception, but also a continuous and self-sustaining identity, a capacity for memory, planning, and self-reflection. In split-brain patients, it could be argued that only the dominant hemisphere possesses these qualities in a robust form, while the other hemisphere operates more like a highly intelligent but nonverbal companion, unable to initiate complex social interactions or articulate its inner states. Yet others counter that this position underestimates the autonomy of the nonverbal hemisphere, which can demonstrate memory, learning, and preferences in laboratory tests, even if it lacks speech. Ethically, the recognition of two centers of consciousness raises questions about autonomy and consent. Suppose a medical decision is to be made for a split-brain patient. Should both hemispheres be consulted, perhaps using nonverbal methods to communicate with the right hemisphere? If one hemisphere expresses discomfort or disagreement but cannot speak, is it fair to proceed based only on the verbal hemisphere's approval? These are not purely theoretical concerns. In principle, a hemisphere could experience distress without the other knowing, which would mean that one half of the brain could live with a sense of being overridden or ignored. This possibility makes the study of intra-brain communication not just a matter of scientific curiosity, but also one of moral responsibility toward the patient. Beyond medicine, the phenomenon invites reflection on personal identity over time. If two hemispheres in one head can, under certain circumstances, act in ways that suggest different wills, then what happens if they develop divergent values or memories? Imagine a patient whose left hemisphere, in control of speech, verbally commits to a promise, while the right hemisphere, unable to speak, intends to do the opposite. In a philosophical sense, is this still one person breaking a promise, or is it one person making a promise and another refusing it? If it is the latter, then the everyday assumption that there is a single, continuous moral agent in each human body becomes less certain. The question also extends into the nature of consciousness itself. If two centers of awareness can exist in one body, then perhaps the boundaries of personhood are not as clear-cut as we believe. Could the same be true, in some form, for people with certain neurological or psychiatric conditions? Could future technologies, such as brain-computer interfaces, create or merge centers of awareness in ways that blur identity even further? The split-brain patient becomes a natural experiment in testing these boundaries, forcing us to think ahead to scenarios where our moral frameworks may no longer fit neatly. There is also a more existential dimension. If unity of self is, at least in part, an illusion constructed by the brain's integrative processes, then perhaps all of us, even without surgery, are composed of multiple semi-independent subsystems, constantly negotiating to produce the appearance of a single voice in the mind. In this view, split brain surgery does not create two persons out of one so much as it removes the connective tissue that hides the multiplicity already present. This realization can be unsettling, but it can also be liberating. It suggests that the self is less a fixed entity and more a dynamic coalition, and that changes in the brain, whether through injury, surgery, or development, shift the balance of that coalition. From a moral standpoint, however, this view complicates responsibility. If actions arise from competing subsystems rather than a unified will, then to what extent can anyone be held fully accountable? In split-brain cases, the division is simply more obvious and dramatic, but perhaps it points to a deeper truth about all human behavior, that what we call I is an ongoing negotiation among many processes, only some of which are accessible to conscious control. The ethical challenge is whether our systems of justice, caregiving, and interpersonal trust can accommodate this more fragmented view of agency without collapsing into relativism or fatalism. Some ethicists propose a pragmatic approach. Treat the patient as one person for social and legal purposes, while acknowledging in research and care that two partially autonomous systems exist. This allows society to maintain functional categories for responsibility and rights, while also giving due respect to the complexity of the patient's lived experience. Others worry that this underplays the moral significance of the nonverbal hemisphere's potential suffering or dissent, effectively silencing half of a person. They suggest that, at least in certain contexts, efforts should be made to engage both hemispheres in decision-making, much as we strive to include nonverbal individuals in conversations about their care. The philosophical implications are not confined to medicine or law. They ripple into personal relationships, self-conception, and even spiritual beliefs. A person who comes to see themselves as containing two centers of awareness might experience a shift in their sense of unity and purpose. They might imagine an inner dialogue more literally than most people do, or cultivate practices, through art, movement, or meditation, that engage both hemispheres more equally. This in turn could lead to a richer but also more complex sense of self, one that accepts internal plurality as a permanent condition. In the end, the question of whether there are two people in one head may not have a single definitive answer. It may depend on how we define personhood, on which capacities we consider essential, and on whether we privilege verbal expression as the primary marker of a mind. What is certain is that split-brain research forces us to confront the possibility that the unity of the self is contingent, fragile, and perhaps not as absolute as we have long assumed. This realization has the power to reshape ethics, philosophy, and our everyday understanding of what it means to be human, challenging us to imagine identities that are multiple yet still whole, divided yet still capable of shared agency. In this sense, the split-brain patient is not just a subject of medical interest, but a living mirror held up to the rest of us, reflecting the hidden complexities within every mind. Studying the split brain has profoundly expanded our understanding of the human mind, consciousness, and brain function, providing a unique window into how complex neural systems produce this seamless experience of being. The division of the corpus callosum in patients offered neuroscientists an unprecedented natural experiment that revealed the brain's remarkable modularity and the ways in which its two hemispheres contribute differently to cognition, perception, and behavior. This knowledge has not only illuminated basic neuroscience, but has also inspired new approaches in clinical medicine, psychology, and even the development of artificial intelligence systems. One of the most significant contributions of split brain research is its insight into the nature of consciousness itself. By demonstrating that each hemisphere can independently process information, learn, and sometimes even behave as if it were a separate conscious agent, the studies challenge the traditional notion of a unitary, indivisible self. Consciousness, once considered a singular phenomenon tied to one brain or mind, is now understood as potentially divisible, distributed, and context-dependent. This has profound philosophical implications, but it also has practical consequences for how scientists conceptualize the neural correlates of consciousness. What brain structures and processes give rise to subjective experience? Moreover, the split brain findings have helped to refine models of lateralization, which describe how different cognitive functions are specialized to one hemisphere or the other. Understanding that language, analytical reasoning, and logical processing tend to reside primarily in the left hemisphere, while spatial awareness, pattern recognition, and emotional processing often dominate the right, has allowed researchers to better interpret brain scans, design more targeted therapies for brain injury, and understand the variability among individuals in cognitive strengths and vulnerabilities. This lateralization also informs how the brain compensates when damaged, illuminating the plasticity and adaptability of neural circuits. Clinically, the split brain procedure itself, once considered a radical last resort, has become a model for neurosurgical interventions that balance risks and benefits for patients with severe epilepsy or other intractable neurological conditions. By understanding the consequences of severing the corpus callosum, surgeons and neurologists can better predict which patients are likely to benefit and how to manage post-surgical rehabilitation. The lessons learned have also encouraged the development of less invasive treatments that target abnormal brain activity while preserving as much neural connectivity as possible. Additionally, research into interhemispheric communication has spurred innovations in neuroprosthetics and brain-machine interfaces, which aim to restore or augment brain function by facilitating new pathways of neural interaction. From a psychological standpoint, split brain studies have deepened our appreciation of the complexity underlying decision-making, self-control, and identity. The discovery that conflicting impulses can arise from different hemispheres has influenced therapeutic approaches for disorders involving impulse control, dissociation, and trauma. It suggests that certain mental health conditions might be understood in terms of disrupted communication between brain regions or competing internal systems. This perspective opens up novel avenues for psychotherapy, pharmacology, and neuromodulation techniques, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, where targeted interventions could rebalance hemispheric interactions. The implications of split brain research extend far beyond human biology into the realm of artificial intelligence and cognitive computing. As AI developers strive to create machines that mimic human cognition and awareness, understanding how the brain integrates multiple streams of information into a coherent whole provides valuable design principles. The brain's ability to maintain specialized processing modules, each optimized for different tasks, while coordinating their outputs to produce unified behavior suggests architectures for AI that are both distributed and integrative. These insights challenge simplistic, monolithic models of intelligence and encourage the construction of systems with parallel processing units that communicate efficiently but retain functional autonomy. In fact, the notion of multiple agents within a single system has inspired computational models that simulate conflicting goals, negotiation, and dynamic balancing of competing processes, features crucial for flexible, adaptive AI. Such architectures could better handle ambiguity, multitasking, and context shifts, mirroring the human brain's strategy of dividing labor across specialized yet interconnected subsystems. By studying how split brains function, AI researchers can also explore the limits of artificial consciousness, ethical considerations for machine autonomy, and the potential for machines to hold multiple minds or perspectives simultaneously. Future research building on split brain findings promises to deepen these insights even further. Advances in neuroimaging, electrophysiology, and genetic techniques allow scientists to observe the brain's interhemispheric interactions in ever finer detail, both in healthy individuals and in patients with partial or complete disconnection. New technologies such as optogenetics and chemogenetics, currently used primarily in animal models, may one day enable reversible and highly precise modulation of communication between hemispheres, providing causal evidence about their roles and interactions. Such experiments could clarify how consciousness arises from distributed networks and how the brain resolves conflicts or integrates diverse inputs into a unified experience. The development of non-invasive brain stimulation methods also holds promise for therapeutic applications inspired by split brain research. For example, selectively enhancing or inhibiting activity in one hemisphere could improve cognitive function in patients with stroke, traumatic brain injury, or neurodegenerative diseases. Understanding how the hemispheres compensate for each other might lead to rehabilitation strategies that harness this plasticity more effectively. This research also intersects with personalized medicine, as individuals vary in how lateralized their functions are and in how well they respond to different interventions. Furthermore, the social and ethical dimensions raised by split brain studies continue to motivate interdisciplinary scholarship. As neuroscience pushes the boundaries of what it means to be a person, new questions emerge about autonomy, consent, and identity in medical, legal, and everyday contexts. The split brain patient serves as a powerful reminder that our common sense notions of a unified self are deeply rooted in brain architecture, which can be altered or divided. Future research that integrates neuroscience with philosophy, ethics, and law will be critical to developing frameworks that respect the complexity of human minds and provide just and compassionate care. In educational settings, insights from split brain research inform teaching strategies that take into account hemispheric specialization. For example, knowing that spatial reasoning and verbal reasoning can engage different neural circuits encourages educators to tailor learning materials to leverage both hemispheres effectively. This could improve outcomes in subjects like mathematics, language arts, and art education by presenting information in multimodal formats that promote integration. Understanding how the brain's two halves cooperate also underscores the importance of early childhood experiences that stimulate balanced development and prevent rigid hemispheric dominance. In summary, the study of split brain patients has been a cornerstone of modern cognitive neuroscience, shaping our understanding of consciousness, brain function, and human identity. It has catalyzed clinical advances that improve the lives of patients with neurological disorders, influenced psychological theory and therapy, and inspired innovative designs in artificial intelligence. As technology advances and interdisciplinary collaboration grows, future research will continue to unravel the mysteries of how the brain's divided yet interconnected architecture gives rise to the rich tapestry of human experience. This ongoing exploration not only deepens scientific knowledge, but also challenges and enriches our philosophical and ethical perspectives on what it means to be conscious, responsible, and alive.